In our final 2 lectures of this section of the course, we're going to challenge some of the basic and core principles that we've covered. In this lecture, we're going to talk about interpretivist approaches to research, and next time, applied research. To this point, everything we've discussed has been largely consistent with what is called the positivist approach to research. Positivism asserts that there is an objective, observable reality that we can study. Using systematic design and data collection, we can figure out the truth that is out there. The principles of reliability and validity get at the heart of this. By saying that we want a consistent and truthful measure of a variable, we're assuming that there is a single right result that we can measure. We just have to make sure we capture it. A student earns a single correct score on an exam. We just have to make sure that the teacher is properly trained to the grading rubric to ensure the exam gets that score. A country is a democracy or it isn't. We just have to outline the criteria that distinguish between the two and apply them correctly. Interpretivists would say that's all completely bogus. Interpretivism is a completely different perspective on research from the positivist approaches we've considered so far. Interpretivists argue that there is no single objective reality that can be observed. Instead, everything is open to subjective interpretation, with the possibility of multiple layers of meaning and multiple truths. Interpretive work is therefore often less focused on testing theories. It focuses on a more inductive process of first gathering data and observations, not to test pre-existing ideas, but to explore, understand, and interpret. Theory, if it happens, comes less from prior observation and logical principles, but from interpretation of data. For example, consider ongoing debates about consent culture in sexual relationships. The same event, say a sexual encounter between 2 individuals, can be interpreted very differently by each person involved. To one, the encounter is entirely consensual. Their partner never objected to anything that the 2 people did together. But to the other person, the lack of objection was never an enthusiastic yes. The person worried what would happen if he or she said no. To him or her, therefore, the encounter wasn't consensual at all. The objective truth is that a sexual encounter occurred, but that hardly captures the complete story, and the differing interpretations of what happened could have serious implications for both parties. Well, what does this interpretivist approach call into question? Well, the deductive approach to theory building and hypothesis testing is typically of less interest. The focus here is not always on testing theories, as most of the methods we've talked about so far aim at doing. Instead, you often start with no theory or expectations, but instead gather data through observing people, their writings and artifacts, and talking to them. From there, you find themes and build theory. The idea of reliability of measures may also be an issue. Reliability aims at ensuring the measurement process is consistent, systematic, and value neutral. Interpretivists question whether that's even possible. Researchers also often talk about the importance of random sampling, but that may not be the best approach here either, as generalizing generally assumes that different subjects or cases can be treated as functionally the same. And since we interview particular people, not chosen at random, generalization may be much more difficult. So this approach is not great for trying to generalize to other actors or cases. So when should you use interpretivist approaches? Choosing an interpretivist approach can be more like choosing a philosophy than a design for a particular project. Once you start walking down a path of rejecting the existence of objective, rational truths in favor of subjective realities, it can be a little hard to go back. Many researchers classify themselves as positivists or interpretivists for that reason. You don't have to take sides, but you should be aware of the philosophical differences in the approaches that we've just discussed. Interpretivist approaches can be applied to a wide range of methodologies. We'll discuss their use in content analysis, for example, when we get to qualitative analysis of document data later in the course. For now, we're going to discuss one type of research where interpretivist approaches are widely used: field research. Now, field research can be done with either positivist or interpretivist methodologies. It can be inductive or deductive. Field research as a general approach is a good choice when the data you need can't be acquired locally through other means. Maybe it isn't available in readily accessible datasets, documents, or existing studies. You can't gather a bunch of primary sources and just code them in your office. The data you need requires observation or interviews of your subjects. And that means you have to travel to wherever they are and study them on their own turf. We call this going into the field, and you might do this to do an experiment or survey, or to conduct interviews for a case study, or to visit an archive, or to conduct a focus group. In this sense, field research as a category is more about the location of your data collection than a research design in and of itself. Ethnography, on the other hand, is a particular type of field research that entails embedding oneself in the community under study, typically to engage in participant observation. It's a dominant methodology in the field of anthropology and focuses less on explaining outcomes or events and maybe more on understanding a set of actors, a culture, or a community. So if your goal is to engage in research on communities and cultures through firsthand observation and analysis, ethnography might be a good choice. So let's say that you've decided that field research is the right path for your project. How do you do it? Well, there are a number of practical considerations to keep in mind before beginning field research. We've been talking about field research as if it requires that you fly off to another country and spend 6 months there. It's true that a lot of field research looks like that. Clifford Gertz, an American anthropologist, spent years in Bali while working on his books on the people of Java. But field research doesn't have to mean flying halfway around the world and giving up everything to immerse yourself in an unfamiliar culture. The field refers to any location where you're going to collect data on the local inhabitants. That might be in Bali, or it might be in your backyard if you were interested in studying the behavior of squirrels. It might be going to your favorite brunch spot and observing the behaviors of the people who eat there. Or you might do an ethnographic study of your office mates. You're engaging in the collection of primary source data, and that can be done wherever there are subjects worth studying. For many people and many studies, that's closer to home than you might think. A colleague of mine, for example, was interested in studying the formation and persistence of identities. She started her research in the city she lived in. It made it a lot easier to schedule interviews. Sometimes, though, your project will require you to travel to a location and potentially stay there for a while. This means that field research can require extensive planning and funding. You want to maximize efficiency when you're in the field. Very few of us can spend as much time in the field as we want. Money will run out, our bosses need us back in the office, and our families might want to spend time with us. Grants can help with the money problem. Taking leaves of absence can assist with the work pressure, and sometimes you can bring your family with you. But still, ultimately, you will probably have to come back at some point. So that means you need to plan carefully for your trip to make the most of it. First, you'll want to consider how long you need to be in the field. If you need to review documents in an archive, this might be a few weeks. Interviews depend on how many people you want to talk to, how long each interview takes, and the availability of your subjects. You might need just a few days or weeks or months. Participant observation can even require months to years. It may take months just to gain access to the community you wish to study. The longer you need to be in the field, the more funding you'll need. Grants and fellowships are a good option here. They can fund your travel and living costs as well as any needed supplies or assistance. Sometimes an ideal place for your research can coincide with somewhere you already have local resources, such as family and friends. That can make a research trip much more affordable. You also need to consider the timing of when you go. What makes the most sense for your schedule might not be great for the local community. Be mindful of seasons, holidays, holy days, and local events. August in Europe might be a great time for you, but that's when a lot of people take their annual vacations, potentially leaving fewer people for you to talk to. If you want to talk to government officials, you'll want to make sure you're in town when the legislature's in session, or your contacts might not be around. Once you've picked your dates, making contacts with locals before you arrive can be essential to ease your introduction into a community. In some cases, you may be able to arrange interviews ahead of time. Other times that's not possible, but do as much preparation for meeting your subjects as possible. Going into the field unprepared can cost you subjects and data. Intercultural competence is an essential skill here. You need to know how to be respectful and responsive to the needs of your subjects and reflect on your own cultural biases while working with them. Your subjects are doing you a big favor by participating in your research, and you owe them respect. Ethical considerations require us to engage in research that doesn't simply benefit us, but our subjects themselves. Failing to be respectful of our subjects can cause real harm to our subjects, and it can also harm our research. Subjects may be less cooperative and willing to participate, not only in our research, but for future researchers to come. That person or community may be skeptical of the next researcher to come along if your behavior is suspect. That can hurt the entire enterprise. Of course, sometimes even the most careful training and planning can be thwarted. This happened to me in 2010. I had a research trip to London planned to talk to some policymakers and politicians. I planned the trip for immediately after the end of the spring semester in early May, before everyone would start leaving for vacation. Unfortunately for me, months into the planning, it was announced that a general election for Parliament would be held the week I arrived. Suddenly, no one was available. I still went, thinking I could get some of those people to talk to me after the election on May 6th. But instead, they had the first hung parliament in over 30 years. No one was available. Instead of getting the interviews I needed, I spent most of my time staring at my inbox and phone, waiting for people to return my messages. It was mostly a wasted trip. Finally, remember that anytime you're working with human subjects, observing them, interviewing them, or having them participate in subjects or experiments, you need approval from your ethical review board to ensure you're providing them with adequate protection from the risks of your research. If you're doing your research in another country, you will also need to abide by the ethical standards in that country as well as your own. So we've addressed some of the practical concerns to keep in mind when engaging in field research. Now let's turn our attention to the kinds of data you can collect while in the field. Let's talk particularly about interviews and observation. Interviews are a very common way to collect qualitative data. Interviews are a great way to learn about the motivations of the people or actors you're interested in, to gain subjective understandings of the success or failure of a program, and to learn about the role of people in processes and decision-making. They can be used to learn about the experiences of any population, from everyday people to specific populations such as prisoners or those who have suffered from discrimination, or to elite decision-makers at the highest levels of power. Traditional interviews allow you to go into great depth with individual people, listening to their perspective and hearing their story. Interviews are often done in person at a place of mutual convenience to both the interviewer and interviewee. But thanks to modern technology, they can be done without you ever leaving home. Interviews can be done via email or chat, by phone, or via web conferencing programs. Doing your interviews from a distance can be a great way to lower the costs of getting your data. You may not actually have to go into the field at all. The biggest issue with interviews is access. It can be very difficult to find subjects willing to talk to you. You're asking people, potentially very busy people, to give you 30 minutes or more of their time for your project, often without any compensation. You may be asking them to talk about sensitive topics and to potentially record their responses. Promises of confidentiality and the benefits of your research may not be enough to get someone to talk to you. This is why many people who do interviews use snowball sampling. A snowball sample, you may recall, is one where you identify one or more subjects and then ask them to introduce you to additional subjects. Think of it like a snowball rolling down a hill. It starts small but accumulates more snow, more subjects along the way. Identifying and gaining access to one subject is a more achievable task. Their introduction can serve as a proxy for the insider status that you don't have. You're relying on the connections and reputation of your initial contact to gain access to new people rather than your own. But there are downsides to this. Since your sample isn't random, you can end up with a biased, unrepresentative sample. Your contact is more likely to introduce you to friends and allies than those who might contradict their viewpoint. So you might need several snowballs for that reason. Another issue is that this process can take time. Instead of scheduling a bunch of interviews ahead of time, you're relying on each subject to introduce you to more people. Those people will then need to be scheduled either for later in your trip or perhaps by phone or web conference after you return. Let's say you've solved the access problem. Your challenges don't end there. You have to be prepared for the fact that your subjects may lie to you, or at the very least, they will tell you their truth, not necessarily a representative perspective. Remember what we just learned about interpretivism? They may be trying to impress you or protect or enhance their reputations, or they may have other motivations beyond telling you that the total and completely honest story you're hoping to get. Triangulating what you're told against other sources of data can be really helpful in separating truth and fiction. Another reason why you need a lot of advanced preparation before going into the field. You also have to guard against your own assumptions and biases that you may bring to the table. Your subjects may tell you things that don't fit your understanding of events or that you think are wrong. You need to recognize when your pre-existing beliefs and biases are affecting your responses to a subject and try to stay as neutral as possible. Otherwise, your data could end up biased in favor of telling the story you want to tell. I know that earlier we determined that some of our research adages don't apply in interpretivist work. Rest assured that the restriction against doing research to prove your ideas correct still stands. And finally, you need to make sure that you are utterly prepared. You should do a thorough review of all the secondary sources of data you can find before starting any interviews. Otherwise, you risk wasting your time and that of your subject. You won't know what questions to ask, or you'll ask them things that you could easily have found out through other sources. You have a limited amount of time with each person. Maximize it by making sure that every question you ask is one you couldn't have had answered in another way. Now let's talk about the interview questions themselves. Interview question styles are typically divided into 3 categories: structured, semi-structured, and unstructured. Structured interviews are functionally the same as a survey. It's a set list of questions that doesn't change from person to person. Everyone is asked the same questions regardless of their responses. For that reason, the interviewer doesn't play as much of a role in the interview itself. This is why this style of interview is typically done as an oral or written survey. An unstructured interview is the exact opposite. This is entirely open-ended. The interviewer typically doesn't have a list of questions at all. Instead, control of the conversation is largely in the hands of the subject to tell their story however they want. Each interview is completely unique and based entirely on the interaction of the subject and the interviewer. You may ask probing questions along the way or have topics you hope to cover, but by and large, each interview won't consist of the same questions. If you wanted to hear someone's personal narrative of some experience they had, this is generally a good style. The semi-structured interview is perhaps the most typical and common type of interview. It's a combination of the structured and unstructured styles. Like a structured survey, the interviewer may have a list of questions or just some topics and themes they plan to ask all of their subjects. But like unstructured surveys, there's a freedom for the interviewer to tailor questions to the particular person, to ask new questions as follow-ups, and to allow the interview to go into unplanned directions. Once you've settled on a type of interview, you need to consider how you will keep track of the data that you collect. You have 3 basic options for recording your interview data obtained from a face-to-face interview. You can record the audio or video of the conversation. You can take notes during the conversation or have someone do that for you. Or you can write down your recollections after the fact. There are advantages and disadvantages to all of these. Recording the interview will ensure the best record of the conversation, but you may have more of a reactivity problem here. The subject, knowing they will be recorded, may be less forthright with their true opinions. This is why it's essential that you review your protocols with them, including promises of confidentiality, anonymity in quoting, ability to review the tapes afterwards and strike anything from the record, and potentially the destruction of the raw recordings following transcription. Reviewing those assurances may reassure many subjects, but some will still hesitate to be completely honest. Taking notes instead of recording can solve this problem, but it creates a new one. If you're focused on taking notes, it may inhibit your ability to create rapport with your subject. With semi-structured and open-ended interviews, this can be a real concern, as you have to both write down what your subject has already said and think of follow-up questions. Unless you know shorthand or are an incredibly fast note-taker, you'll also likely miss some details and be unable to produce exact quotes for later. Taking notes after the interview is over avoids the reactivity issue of recording the interview and the impersonal interaction and risk of distraction that arises from taking notes throughout. But it's the least likely method to produce an accurate record of the conversation. You'll be making subjective judgments immediately on what were the important parts of the conversation, which can lead to biases in the data collection. And you might not have time to sit down immediately and record what you remember. You might be introduced to a new subject as an interview is ended and need to take the opportunity to speak to them right away. Or you may need to travel across town to your next interview. You might not be able to sit down and record your thoughts until much later. In such cases, you'll lose even more of the data or potentially confuse one subject's responses with another. I only ever use this post-interview style of recording notes when I'm interviewing someone for a job. I don't need to remember everything word for word, so a full digital recording is only needed if a colleague can't attend the interviews. And taking notes can stress out a job applicant. They want to know what I'm writing down, so I usually just jot down my thoughts after each interview. Anytime I'm doing research interviews, though, I always ask to audio record the interview. If a subject refuses, which happens occasionally, then I take notes during the interview instead and highlight key points in my notes immediately afterward. Of course, if your interview isn't face-to-face, you have other options. If you're using a phone or web conferencing program, you're already interfacing through technology, so taking notes while the person is talking might not feel as impersonal as it can when face-to-face. I type very fast, so I can usually transcribe the entire interview while we're talking without suffering the same issues of rapport or distraction that I might in a face-to-face environment. Another option is to conduct the interview over email or chat. That gives you a written record of the interview in their own words. Regardless of which methods you employ, the interview is a very useful staple in our data gathering toolbox, and not only for field research, but we also have to consider another prominent method, that of observation. We've been talking about observations for a while. That's what research is, after all, recording and interpreting observations of our chosen subjects. In field research, observation is about observing the behavior of our subjects in the field, in their local environment, not in the artificial construct of the laboratory. Now, observation can be direct or indirect. Indirect observation is where you observe the indirect behavior of your subjects, perhaps by reviewing and recording the objects, evidence, or artifacts they leave behind. Direct observation, on the other hand, is where you're observing your subjects directly, not the aftermath of their behavior, but the behavior itself. For example, let's say you're studying the organizational habits of your colleagues. You can directly observe them to watch whether they put things away after they use them and their other personal habits. Or you could walk into their office and code it for how organized or messy it appears to be. Observation is great because it lets you as the researcher assess the behavior of your subjects without their perspective interfering. You aren't asking people how they would behave, you're observing their behavior yourself. So there's less risk of people forgetting or lying to you about their behaviors, particularly those that might have a reason to hide. On the other hand, it means you'll lack the context of knowing about their motivations or justifications for their actions. So you can run the risk of making assumptions about why people behave the way they do. This is one reason why observations and interviews combined together can be very effective sources of data. One of the key kinds of observation commonly used in ethnographic studies is participant observation. This basically means you're not only an observer, but to some degree a participant in whatever community or society you're studying. The goal is to learn about the culture or society from the perspective of the members of that culture or society. The level of your participation and how aware the community members are that you're a researcher can vary. For example, you might be part of the community but not directly engaging with members. So a little more observer, a little less participant. Maybe you're observing people at your public library, trying to determine the various reasons for why people patronize the library, to check out books, music, or movies, to use a computer, to get a quiet place to rest or study, to attend a lecture, or any number of other reasons. You might also covertly embed yourself in a community. You become a participating member of the community for the purposes of research, but the members don't know that you're there to study them. This kind of method has been used to study cults and gangs and other organizations where admitting your status as a researcher would prevent you getting access to the group. Another kind of participant observation is where you're open about your status as a researcher in the community you're studying. This is perhaps the most typical kind of participant observation. Clifford Gertz, the American anthropologist well known for his studies of Bali, is a classic example of this kind of participant observer. He struggled at first to gain purchase in the community where he was treated as an outsider. His breakthrough came during a cockfight he attended with his wife. Cockfights were a regular but technically illegal part of the social fabric of this community, but this particular one was held without paying off the local authorities. When those authorities showed up, all the locals fled, and Gertz and his wife followed their lead. The locals then went through elaborate setups to make it appear to authorities that they were never at the cockfight. The Gertzes took refuge in a local's house and helped in this charade, pretending they had been visiting with this local family the entire time. After this particular bit of participation, Gertz was in, and the community opened up to him for the thick description he would engage in during the remainder of his time in Bali. The key to good observational research, regardless of your approach, is to take excellent notes and record whatever you can. But even when you have excellent recordings, you'll need to supplement this with your own observations of what else is going on. You need to be as comprehensive as possible because often in the moment, you won't know what's important. That means recording whatever you can about the who, what, when, where, why, and how of the people, community, and environment that you're observing. You'll want to go over your notes regularly to mark anything of importance and to begin your analysis. And of course, as with any method, observation has some drawbacks. First, it can take a lot of money and time depending on your project. You can design a project that is smaller and more local, but true participant observation can require a significant investment of time. Second, you have to consider biases in your data. There's that reactivity problem of your subjects knowing that they're under study, and that's why some studies are done covertly. But you also have your own biases, your assumptions and pre-existing ideas, yes, but also cognitive biases that may interfere with your ability to take complete and correct notes on the subjects you're observing. You may not remember everything, or you may find that you tend to focus on some particular subjects or events rather than keeping a wider perspective. Finally, keep in mind that your analysis is probably going to be restricted to the group or community under study. It may be difficult to generalize your results to other groups, as participant observation typically doesn't involve a lot of random sampling. Well, we covered quite a bit in this lesson. We questioned some of the basic principles of research we've considered from the beginning by considering the interpretivist approach to research. Then we looked at one of the methods where interpretivist approaches are commonly used, field research, and discussed the use of interviews and observations as methods of gathering qualitative data. Before we move on to data analysis, we have one more type of research to consider, that of applied research design such as action and evaluation research.